when they have an attraction to children, they want to address that. Don't shout them down for it. It's something that they are trying to better themselves, to actually cope with the very serious issue, and they are choosing not to offend.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Prostasia Foundation's podcast-vodcast series, Sex, Human Rights and CSA Prevention. This month we're talking to Lauren Stevens, who is a PhD candidate at the University of Portsmouth in the Institute for Criminal Justice Studies, where she's studying child sexual victimisation prevention.
Hello Lauren, and thank you for joining us today.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. It's great to be here.
So the first question I have for you is, tell us something about your current research.
Okay, so my current research is part of my PhD thesis, by which I hope to complete by the end of next year. And essentially what I'm doing is a two-phased research project. So it's kind of a mixed methods approach where I have done a public perception survey, which is about establishing the current awareness and common attitudes the general public have about paedophilia, people with minor attraction, and also prevention and support networks that are out there for people that are trying to prevent sexual offending. So the second phase of my research are interviews, which are currently consisting of active scholars and researchers in the area, individuals that are involved in organisations that are advocating for child sexual prevention, and providing support for minor attracted people either via the internet or via a support service that, depending on obviously where around the world they are, whether they be in the US, in the UK, Canada, Netherlands, Germany, to name just a few. So that's currently what I've been doing at the moment, and I've got some quite interesting data. So essentially what the aim of the PhD is essentially doing is to critically analyse these common understandings of paedophilia from the public and from that association with child sexual offending, and then how that encompasses within their assumption of minor attracted people and how they seem to be one of the same thing, as well as kind of evaluating what we currently have out there for support structures and networks for minor attracted people. And I suppose the end purpose is to identify those areas of improvement and how we can encourage more positive community engagement in these services. And now we can actually reach out to these really isolated, stigmatised group of individuals.
So what led you to choose this area of research?
So my actual background before this was into carceral research, so prison research, where I had practical experience of working with child sex offenders and their families who are visiting them in the prison setting. And I've also done public perception survey in looking at the perception of risk and dangerousness that child sex offenders pose within the community after being released from prison and currently undergoing a rehabilitation treatment program. And based on that data that I received, there's a very interesting quote that I just would like to refer to, which kind of led me to consider this area. So this particular participant said that prevention is better than intervention, rather than leave it to the last minute when it's too late, because that is unforgivable. If they come forward, I would gladly help. So that participant was essentially saying that child sexual abuse is an unforgivable act and it's an abhorrent act. However, to provide someone with support for their attraction before they've just actually gone ahead and potentially have abused a child or groomed a child for some, in various contexts, they'd be happy to support them through their difficult times. So from that quote, I became very interested in looking up prevention strategies and projects that were currently out there, and I came across Dunkerfeld Project in Germany, which was particularly insightful into their approach of kind of making a very public campaign to reach out to those who had an attraction to children and they understood that they liked children the way that they shouldn't, in such a words to that effect. So that's kind of how I got into this, and I just got into the reading, really, and the current research, which is quite sparse. Yeah. And it is a very highly under-researched area still. That's what I want to contribute to.
Well, we'll talk a little bit more about why that is as we go on. But firstly, what are the main public misperceptions that exist around pedophilia and prevention?
Yeah, so within my current research, when I did the public perception survey, which is the first phase of my research, and it's no surprise to most people that are in this area in terms of research, is that child sex offenders are synonymous with paedophilia. And someone who is a child sex offender has committed a sexual offence against a minor, whereas a paedophile is a clinical diagnosis and not necessarily equates to someone who has an attraction to minors. It doesn't necessarily equate to being an eventual offender. The general misperceptions of people who they identify as being paedophiles is usually associated with they cannot control themselves, so they are going to be inevitable offenders. They will abuse a child eventually, and that is simply not the case. As someone that has a minor attraction is not destined to abuse a child, and people who are child sex offenders are not necessarily have a paedophilic interest in children. Those individuals, they have varying reasons why they end up abusing a child. It's wrong to assume, although understandably in terms of the current climate of how we view this group of people, and usually tends to be the knee-jerk reaction is to assume that they are one of the same.
Yeah. Well, we've interviewed 4 or 5 professionals, either from the research side or the clinical side, and they've all said the same thing. So if this is such a widespread misconception, how has it arisen, and how is this belief maintained?
Okay, well, I think it's no surprise that when we read any, say, tabloid press or any kind of social media posts, they tend to be extremely punitive and usually quite using such negative slurs to describe them as one of the same group. So individuals who have abused a child get branded pedos, sickos, and all the other negative slurs that are out there. And that those titles, those labels are then applied to people online who are genuinely concerned potentially about their minor attraction, and they have other associated mental health issues, which doesn't necessarily help in squashing that general assumption. It's somewhat, I suppose, maintained continuously because the general rhetoric that we read and what we see is still the same as when it was back in like the stranger danger days almost. It's still the same kind of rhetoric. We may not use that particular term anymore, but the general message kind of resonates the same way. And also the introduction of recently those, for example, vigilante groups who are, or paedophile hunter groups, for example, those sorts of portrayals do solidify people's assumptions of paedophiles as being that lonely, weird, middle-aged man that's lurking behind a playground for children or online chat rooms. And people who have a minor attraction, to associate that image of the paedophile to being someone who is just minor attracted, is a wrong assumption to make.
So it's a very deeply embedded one, though, in society. How do you think, what sort of strategies could we adopt if we wanted to gradually overturn that false assumption?
Mm-hmm. So on that individual level basis, I think it's a case of that we need to challenge our own biases. So including me as a researcher as well, it's a very eye-opening experience in kind of reading into this, researching into this. It's not what it appears to be based on our emotional assumptions and what we associate with a minor attracted person as being a child sex abuser. It's something that we need to read the research that's out there and actually consider how we move forward. Because at the end of the day, whether you are a researcher, whether you are just a member of the public, an organisation, a support service, or a person who is minor attracted, we all have this common goal of course we want to prevent child sexual abuse. That is what we all want to do, that we all have that in common. Although it makes it very hard to kind of have that conversation when those assumptions are still out there. So in terms of other individuals, not just us, but we should provide more training out there for mental health professionals and licensed therapists, because this is a very tricky area for someone to identify as someone who has a minor attraction, but they feel that they cannot speak to anyone through fear of being outed, through fear of being ridiculed, being reported to the point where your life would be effectively changed beyond repair and destroyed in certain circumstances. So it's about understanding that it is more than just about being minor attracted. This issue encompasses a lot of mental health problems, such as depression, anxiety, self-harm, suicidal thoughts. So it's about kind of approaching it from a therapeutic manner, as well as being aware that for some people, abstaining from any sexual misconduct with a minor, or online or be it in contact, that's obviously an issue, but that doesn't affect them all. It's about looking at that holistic approach. So in terms of strategies that I would recommend, is what I've been discovering in the literature as well as in the interviews is we need to continue to develop the terminology, because among us researchers, mental health professionals, and the public, we do tend to associate them with different varying terminology. So that can be anything from calling them a paedophile, pedo, hebephilia, and minor attracted person. But all of these terms are problematic, even to a minor attracted person, in the sense that it is signifying that that is all they are. And I think that sort of thing, in terms of us as being researchers and kind of working in this area, we need to kind of be careful of our language and kind of consider what the appropriate terminology is for someone, such as using first person language, like person with minor attraction. Sometimes is a lot better to use if an individual is struggling with their own sense of self-worth and identity, and trying to actually get to a good place, so to speak, in their everyday life, and we should just use the terminology in which that person feels comfortable with, not necessarily what we assume that they are, because I think that would definitely help along the way of, making sure this individual is successfully, in that sense, abstaining from any abusive behaviour, but as well as living a good, fulfilling life.
So we've been speaking about how society as a whole suffers from some of these misconceptions and things that we need to do to address those. But what about you specifically as a researcher? What kind of obstacles have you personally experienced in doing your research on this topic?
So for me personally, I think access. So in terms of research, and any researcher will understand the pains of access for data, and especially in an area which it is so stigmatized, it is, and the fear of being outed and ridiculed is so strong among this community. So accessing people with a minor attraction to kind of get that research and kind of work with them is kind of very difficult, and it does come down to trust. And I understand mistrust, because we're speaking to people with a minor attraction as part of the interviews, because they were included in the data collection as well, that the fear of talking openly about the troubles that they have is quite significant, and does degree an element of trust, because they have had bad experiences before where they have been misportrayed in the media, on documentaries and all other sort of journalist kind of media. So access has been a major obstacle for me. In terms of stigma, again, I mean, me personally, and I have not actually experienced much ridicule myself as a researcher. The only thing I have had is, say, for example, I had a friend who has been a long-term friend for about 14 years, so quite a significant long-term friend, who had read what I was doing, and basically was quite standoffish. They were very, very like knee-jerk, saying, "Oh my God, you can't be doing this area of research. It's wrong. It's this. You can't." That kind of general reaction you'd get from someone. And other than that, I've had really good response, even from people of the general public, people I don't know, and people I do know, have said how this is a very important area. It's a very tricky area. They don't envy me for doing it, but at the same time, they understand that it's a really necessary area to do more research in, to be able to understand this group of individuals for their own sake, as well as on the area of child abuse prevention. But I know it's not me personally, but I know some researchers have experienced quite a significant amount of stigma and ridicule online and trolling, and it's just a very unhealthy way of approaching a debate, because this is an area which is quite new and still obviously very highly debated, but to be trolled like that is obviously very, very difficult and quite an obstacle for researchers.
Yeah.
But for me, luckily, I've not actually experienced that.
That's good. You've mentioned a few of the problems that this stigma creates. Are there any other problems that you think are worth mentioning about how stigma makes prevention harder?
Well, in terms of research, funding is obviously a massive issue when it comes to doing research in this area. So as well as funding is hard to come by normally, but having such a difficult area is quite hard and quite a slow research outputs from this area, because people do people do not achieve funding quite so easily. And what I've begun to discover among researchers in this area during these interviews is that the problem is unless you have a approach that is more criminal justice focused, or looking at intervention after an individual has offended against a child, then you're unlikely to get funding in your area. So that's one of the reasons why this area is quite slow to progress, I think. But we are getting there. There is some hope. There's light at the end of the tunnel. We are getting research out there. It just sometimes having that support externally would increase that output, and actually be able to disseminate our research out.
I mean, Prostasia Foundation can say the same story. I mean, we've been around for 2 years, and it would have been much easier for us if we were working in a more criminal justice focused way on more high profile parts of this problem, such as sex trafficking, for example. There's a lot of funding for that. And yet, commercial sex trafficking is a very tiny part of the problem of child sexual abuse. And even pedophilia is a pretty small part of the problem. But working in a prevention focused fashion just seems to be so touchy for people. So it just sets off so many alarm bells for people, and they just don't want to go there a lot of the time, which is a shame. But I do agree with you that I think this is changing slowly, and that we're making some progress, and people are coming around and seeing that really the focus that's solely on criminal justice is never going to solve the problem. And if we just keep on focusing on that exclusively, we're never going to be able to prevent some of these acts of abuse from happening in the first place. So thank you for the work that you're doing and for persevering with it, despite the obstacles.
So there is one other area in which stigma is quite prominent, which I have got into discussions with mental health professionals, is the ones who have a specialism or are open to accepting a client that has a minor attraction is quite few and far between, particularly in the US, which I've discovered. But the problem is even they have reported some stigma in terms of their websites or where they are advertising their specialisms. So they don't tend to be always so open about saying, I will help someone who has a minor attraction. They say something that's entirely very vague, so it can be down to interpretation. So, for example, someone will put abnormal sexualities, just like that. So it allows someone to not associate that person with being what I have heard as a paedophile apologist or sympathisers or anything like that. But it will allow someone with a minor attraction to apply themselves without having to worry about being very vague as to their abnormal sexuality, until they trust the clinician enough to be able to open up and hope that this person will understand and not report them just based on their thoughts alone.
Interesting, yes. So we've been talking about the harms that stigma causes, but something that I've heard people say online is that actually the stigma against pedophilia, or maybe really the stigma against child sexual abuse, which is possibly a separate thing, is good because it ensures that there are very tough social sanctions against offending behaviours. How do you respond to that? Do you think that there is any merit in saying that stigma has a deterrent effect or not?
So with stigma, so that is the process of attaching a discredited label or a discreditable status to an individual or to a group of people. So this can have some severe negative effects on that individual. And I find that in terms of being positive, I understand where they're going in terms of their thinking, that if it is socially unacceptable, therefore people won't think about offending. But in actual fact, when you are doing that, all you're doing is encouraging an individual to be more closed up. So in effect, that has a lot of negative connotations to that. So by doing that, all you're doing is that person who is minor attracted, that label of being, a sex offender, that's a predatory sex offender that's out there to abuse children, all that does is sort of bury them underground almost. They go more, it becomes a more isolated area. And since I have mentioned before that these individuals do suffer from an array of mental health problems, and sometimes range from very significant to minor, depending on the situation. But for someone who is trying to prevent abuse, all you're doing is driving the problem away. For some people, where that, I don't want to call it temptation, but you see what I mean, as being something that is a problem.
Yeah.
You're just burying the problem. You're not solving the problem. And these people are just people at the end of the day, as well as, because I'm just talking about people with a minor attraction here. So those people are just like you and I, but they have this issue that they need to address. And the more and more you drive them underground, the more and more that their mental health problems will get worse. And potentially you might not be able to have stopped a minor attracted person who is who could take that forward into being an abusive situation. So in effect, by doing that, you are not achieving your ultimate goal.
So do you have hope that lawmakers, police and researchers will ever really see eye to eye on child sexual abuse prevention?
Yes, I do, eventually. I'm optimistic in that sense that eventually the tide will turn and it is slowly becoming more open and more out there. We are having these discussions, although I think we need to go further, we need to continue, because at the end of the day, this issue is not just criminal justice focused. This is a very holistic approach. This encompasses a lot it's more of a public health issue more than, say, a criminogenic one. So yes, for them to actually make an effective approach, I do believe that we do start need to working together, and I do see that happening a long, long time, but I think we will get there eventually. But one thing I feel particularly key, that when you said about lawmakers, police and researchers working together, I also believe that including people with a minor attraction who want to work towards this prevention of sexual abuse, we should be working with them, not against them. So in terms of consulting them in about developing effective approaches and what kind of they require as the topic of focus, essentially. So I think it's like what before you act. I think it's their slogan. It's like nothing about us without us. So we do need that connection. We do need those conversations to actually go forwards. I do believe we need to have and open and honest conversations, and not just within academia, because what is the problem most of the time is, and across all fields, not just in this, but academic research tends to is shared among our own communities, but we don't really meet always the public arena. We don't really get it disseminated as far as that. So I think we need to kind of consider ways of how we can approach that. And I think these sorts of podcasts and kind of our presence on social media is a way forward, and we're trying slowly to do that. And I think that's where we need to focus a little bit more on that at the moment, and then eventually get more and more people to listen and to want to understand, because I think that is the key problem in this area is people, I think it's such a sensitive area. The knee-jerk reaction is no, I can't do this. That's not right. I'm not even going to even think about it kind of area.
Yeah, people don't want to have to think about it. And if you tell them facts that differ from their preconceptions or their stereotypes, they just shut down sometimes.
Yeah.
And it's interesting you're saying how we need to involve minor attracted people in the work that we're doing to support them. One of the pushbacks that I've heard about that is, well, it's letting the fox into the hen house. I think, though, at the end of the day, you're right, that, like, we can't even know what is going to help these people to avoid offending if we don't talk to them, if we don't involve them in some way. I mean, surely we're not going to, we're still going to be taking sensible safeguarding steps, obviously. That's important no matter who you're working with, to take safeguarding steps. But to think that we could possibly make a difference to this problem if we're keeping the subjects of our work at arm's length and not talking to them is kind of ridiculous.
To add on to that, when you said about involving minor attracted people under safeguard, I mean, of course, that is, people seem to think that this is all kind of a fluffy land, like these people are fine, there's no safeguarding issues, there's nothing. I mean, of course, there is always going to be that consideration when it comes to people with a minor attraction, but that it's wrong to assume that they all are going to have that particular risk applied to them. It's not all about just the risk of someone abusing. It is also about their own personal mental health and how they can actually live fulfilling, positive lives, like with other people that have got troubling issues that are part of your everyday life. It's hard to live with.
So we've just about run out of time. This has been great. I'll just close with one final question, and you may feel that you've answered this already, but don't. You can just repeat what you've said before, if so. So if there's one thing you wish more people knew about this topic, what would it be?
Okay, well, the simple thing is attraction to children is not a choice, but offending behaviour is. So for some individuals, when they have an attraction to children, they want to address that. Don't shout them down for it. It's something that they are trying to better themselves, to actually cope with the very serious issue, and they are choosing not to offend. That's the issue here. They are not going to be inevitable offenders in every case, and by assuming that they are, you're being part of the problem. And unfortunately, I know that is a hard pill to swallow, but I think that is generally the truth. These individuals are just as much against abuse as you are, and condemn the abuse of a child. They're not working against us. They want to address this issue. They are wanting assistance. That's the whole purpose of this area. It's a false reality that all these MAPs are child sex offenders or will inevitably become one.
Well, I'm very inspired to hear about the work that you're doing, and I wish you all the best with it. Thank you once again for taking the time to talk with me today.
Thank you very much for inviting me. It's been great.
And thank you for joining us for this episode. Next month, we'll be talking to someone else about sex, human rights, and CSA prevention. To make sure you don't miss out, please subscribe to our podcast. Or if you're watching on YouTube, subscribe to our channel, which you can do by clicking this button right here. You can also click to donate to support our work. Thank you very much again for joining us, and we'll see you next month.